The wind came first, a low moan across the plains that sounded like a dying animal. It was a sound born of emptiness, a lament for the endless, sun-cracked earth of the Wyoming Territory. Then came the dust. It rose from the west in a solid wall of ochre, a churning, boiling cloud that swallowed the sky whole, turning the mid-afternoon sun into a tarnished brass button. The world shrank to a grit-choked twilight. In the town of Redemption, what little life there was had already scurried for cover. Doors were barred, windows shuttered. The town itself was little more than a handful of weathered buildings huddled together against the vastness, clinging to a dry creek bed as if it were a promise the land had long since forgotten. It was a place that had been worn down to the bone, its hope scoured away by the same relentless wind that was now flaying its dusty main street. Redemption was a town that did not welcome strangers, for strangers brought trouble, and the people here had enough of their own. Out of the gloom, the stagecoach materialized. It rattled down the street like a skeleton, its horses leaning into their collars, their breath coming in ragged, dusty plumes. The driver, a man whose face was a roadmap of hard miles, pulled the team to a halt in front of the saloon, the only establishment showing a sliver of lamplight. He did not bother to announce his arrival. Anyone with sense was already indoors. The coach door creaked open, and a figure descended. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace that seemed out of place in the frantic, wind-whipped chaos. She was dressed in white, or what had once been white. The fine fabric of her dress was now grayed with dust, the hem frayed and stained with the grime of a long journey. A heavy veil of lace obscured her face, a ghostly shroud that fell from the brim of her hat to the collar of her dress. She carried a single, small valise. She was dressed like a bride who had been traveling through hell. She stood for a moment, a pale specter in the swirling brown haze, her veiled face turned toward the silent, shuttered buildings. The driver tossed her valise into the dust at her feet without a word, then cracked his whip. The stagecoach groaned and lurched forward, disappearing back into the storm as quickly as it had appeared, leaving her utterly alone. She did not watch it go. Her stillness was absolute, a small, fragile island in the roaring sea of the storm. Finally, with a slight squaring of her shoulders, she bent to retrieve her bag and walked toward the faint light of the saloon. The door swung open on complaining hinges, admitting the woman and a furious gust of wind that sent dust and loose papers skittering across the floorboards. The noise inside, a low murmur of conversation and the clink of glasses, died instantly. Every eye turned to her. The air grew thick with a hostile curiosity. Miners, trappers, and disillusioned ranchers, men with hardened faces and suspicious eyes, stared at the veiled figure in the doorway. She paused, letting the door swing shut behind her, plunging the room back into its dim, smoky light. She did not speak. Her veiled head made a slow, sweeping survey of the room, and though no one could see her eyes, they felt her gaze. It was not fearful. It was unnervingly steady. She moved toward the bar, her steps measured and silent on the sawdust-strewn floor. The men parted before her as if she were carrying a plague. The bartender, a portly man with a stained apron and sweat beading on his bald scalp, watched her approach with narrowed eyes. "Looking for someone, ma'am?" he asked, his voice rough. The woman, Emily, shook her head once. A small, almost imperceptible movement. Her own voice, when it came, was so soft it was nearly lost to the howling of the wind outside. "A room," the bartender grunted. "We ain't a hotel. Got a couple rooms upstairs for travelers, is all. Cost you 2 bits. She gave a slight nod. From a small reticule that hung from her wrist, she produced not a coin, but a ring. It was a simple, elegant band of gold. She laid it on the scarred wood of the bar. It gleamed in the lantern light, a small circle of pure, untarnished promise in the grimy saloon. A collective breath was drawn. A gold ring. Not just any ring, but a wedding band. Whispers erupted like sparks in dry tinder. A bride, alone, paying her way with her wedding ring. The story wrote itself in their minds, a lurid tale of scandal and ruin. The bartender picked up the ring, testing its weight in his palm, his expression a mixture of greed and suspicion. He bit it, then nodded. His decision made. The value of the gold far exceeded the price of the room. "Room's at the top of the stairs. Last one on the right," he said, pocketing the ring. "Keys in the door." She gave another slight nod of acknowledgement, but did not move toward the stairs. Instead, she gestured faintly toward a small, vacant table in a dark corner of the room. "And a whiskey." The bartender's eyebrows shot up. A woman like her, dressed like a bride, ordering a whiskey? The whispers grew louder. He poured the drink without another word and slid it across the bar. She carried the glass to the table, her back straight, her movements fluid. She sat with her back to the wall, a silent, white phantom in the shadows. She did not lift her veil. She simply sat, the untouched glass of whiskey before her, and waited. She did not know for what. She only knew how to wait. An hour passed. The storm raged outside, and the men inside drank deeper, their inhibitions worn away by liquor and their tongues loosened by the mystery in their midst. Their stares grew bolder, their comments coarser. "Bet she run off from the altar," one man slurred to his companion, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "Or maybe the groom run off from her," his friend cackled. "Maybe he got a look under that veil and thought better of it." Laughter, raw and cruel, filled the room. Emily did not flinch. She remained as still as a statue, her veiled face betraying nothing. Her stillness only seemed to provoke them further. Three men, emboldened by drink and the pack mentality, detached themselves from the bar and swaggered toward her table. They were big, filthy men who smelled of sweat, cheap liquor, and unwashed bodies. "What's the matter, little lady?" the leader sneered, leaning his grimy hands on her table. "You too good to show us your face." She did not answer, her hands, resting in her lap, clenched into fists beneath the fabric of her dress. "Cat got your tongue?" another one jeered, reaching a hand toward her veil. "Let's just have a little peek." Before his fingers could touch the lace, a shadow fell over the table. It was a long, lean shadow that seemed to suck the warmth from the air. The three men froze, then slowly looked up. A man stood there, tall and broad-shouldered, his frame filling the space beside their table. He was not a young man. His face was weathered leather, carved with lines that spoke of sun and sorrow. His hair was the color of dark earth, shot through with silver at the temples, but it was his eyes that held them. They were a pale, piercing blue, the color of a winter sky, and they were utterly devoid of fear. He looked at the three men, his expression flat, and said nothing. The silence was more menacing than any threat. This was Eli McCrae, a man known in Redemption for two things: the size of his ranch on the edge of the Badlands and the depth of his silence. He had come to town for supplies, been caught by the storm, and had been nursing a single beer at the far end of the bar. Watching. The leader of the trio, his drunken courage faltering, tried to bluster. "This ain't none of your concern. McCrae." Eli's gaze did not waver. He still did not speak. He simply looked from the man's hand, still hovering near Emily's veil, and then back to the man's eyes. The message was clear. A tense moment stretched, thick and heavy. The saloon had gone quiet again. The man slowly, reluctantly, pulled his hand back. He muttered a curse under his breath, then motioned to his friends. Without another word, the three of them shuffled back to the bar, defeated by a silence more powerful than their own drunken noise. Eli did not watch them go. His attention was on the woman. He looked at the rigid line of her back, the white-knuckled grip she had on the edge of the table, hidden by her skirts. He saw not a bride, not a scandal, but something fractured. He recognized the shape of her pain because he carried his own. It was a hollowness, a stillness that came after something precious had been shattered. In the veiled, silent woman before him, he saw an echo of his wife, Sarah. He remembered the stillness that had come over her in those last hours, a quiet surrender to a pain he could not touch or fight. Sarah had been gone 5 years now, taken by a fever that had followed the birth of their stillborn son. He had buried them both on a ridge overlooking the canyon, and with them, he had buried his desire for anything more than the solitude of his land. The whispers in the saloon began to swirl again, weaving a new narrative. Runaway bride, dead husband. Maybe she killed him. A woman alone was a target. A woman with a secret was a threat. But Eli didn't hear the words. He heard only the roaring silence that emanated from her, a silence that matched his own. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw a soul caught in a storm far worse than the one raging outside. He pulled out the chair opposite her and sat down. He didn't ask her name, or where she was from, or why she was dressed in a wedding gown in the middle of a dust storm. He didn't ask her to lift her veil. He just sat, offering her the simple, profound courtesy of his quiet presence. He was a rock in the current of the town's judgment, an anchor in her turmoil. For a long time, they sat without speaking, the untouched whiskey between them. The storm outside began to lose its fury, its howl softening to a weary sigh. The light outside shifted from twilight to the deep, bruised purple of evening. Finally, Eli spoke. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble, a sound that seemed to come from deep within the earth. "The storm's passing, but the night will be cold." She did not respond, but he felt her attention focus on him, a palpable shift in the air. "That room upstairs," he continued, his gaze steady. "It won't be safe. And this town, it doesn't take kindly to questions it can't answer." He paused, letting the truth of his words settle. "You can stay the night at my place. I have a spare room. It's quiet." The offer hung in the air between them. It was an act of profound and reckless kindness in a world that offered little of either. It asked for nothing. It promised only shelter and silence. To the rest of the room, it was a scandal in the making. A lonely widower taking in a mysterious, veiled woman. But to Eli, it was simple. He saw a creature cornered and in pain, and he was offering a safe pasture for the night. Nothing more. Emily's head tilted slightly, as if considering his words. He watched the delicate lace of her veil, wondering what secrets it hid, what sorrow was etched on the face beneath. He expected her to refuse, to shrink from the impropriety of it, from the danger of trusting a stranger. Instead, she gave a single, decisive nod. He stood, putting a few coins on the table to pay for the whiskey she would not drink. "Let's go, then." She rose and followed him. As they walked toward the door, every eye in the saloon followed them, their stares burning into her back. She did not look back. She kept her eyes on the broad, steady set of Eli's shoulders as he pushed the door open into the cold, clean air of the night. The dust had settled, leaving the world washed new and raw under a brilliant canopy of stars. A sliver of moon hung in the inky sky, casting the Badlands in sharp, skeletal relief. The air was cold and bit at the skin, carrying the clean scent of rain that had fallen somewhere far to the north. Eli's ranch was a few miles out of town, a lonely collection of buildings huddled against the base of a mesa. A solitary light burning in one window. He had a wagon, but he chose to walk, leading a horse he'd left tied at the rail. He seemed to think she might need the slowness of the walk, the time to breathe the clean air. He did not try to make conversation. He walked beside her, matching his long stride to her shorter one, the silence between them comfortable, profound. When they reached the small, sturdy ranch house, he stopped at the door, turning to face her. The moonlight silvered the edges of her veil, making her seem ethereal, a spirit of the lonely prairie. He reached for the door latch, but paused. She moved first, slowly. She lifted her hands to her hat and untied the ribbons that held the veil. Then, with a grace that was heartbreaking to watch, she removed her shawl. It was a beautiful thing of fine, cream-colored wool, intricately woven. For a moment, she held it clutched in her hands, her one piece of armor against the cold and the prying eyes of the world. Then, her fingers uncurled. She let it drop. It fell without a sound, pooling at her feet on the wooden porch. A soft, discarded skin. It was an act of utter surrender, and yet an act of defiance, a silent declaration. Here I am. See me. He saw not a ruined woman, not a runaway bride, but a soul laid bare, offering up its vulnerability in a gesture of profound, desperate trust. His breath caught in his throat. He watched the shawl lie in the dust, a fallen flag of truce, but said nothing. He simply opened the door and stood aside to let her pass. He showed her to the spare room. It was small and simple, but clean. It had been his wife's sewing room. A single bed was covered with a patchwork quilt, and a small wooden nightstand held a clean, unlit lantern. "The house is quiet," he said from the doorway. "Nothing will bother you here." She stood in the center of the room, her back to him. She nodded once. He waited a moment longer, then pulled the door mostly shut, leaving it cracked open just enough for a sliver of light from the main room to enter. He went to the hearth and stirred the dying embers of the fire. Adding a log, he sat in his worn leather chair, the one he had sat in every night for 5 years, and stared into the flames. He thought he would feel the old, familiar ache of loneliness. Instead, he felt a strange, unsettling awareness of the woman in the next room. He could hear the faint creak of the floorboards as she moved, the soft rustle of her dress. He felt her presence like a pressure change in the air, a warmth seeping through the walls. In her room, Emily did not undress. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands folded tightly in her lap, and listened to the sounds of the strange house, the whisper of the wind around the eaves, the crackle of the fire in the next room, the slow, steady breathing of the man who had offered her shelter. She was 1,000 miles from everything she had ever known, her life in ashes behind her. She was terrified, but for the first time in a very long time, she was not alone in her silence. That night, neither of them slept. The old house stood watch under the cold, indifferent stars, holding 2 broken souls in its quiet embrace. The silence was no longer empty. It was heavy, alive, thick with unspoken pain, shared sorrow, and the first terrifying flicker of a forbidden and forgotten desire. Morning arrived like a whisper of glass, etching delicate traceries of frost onto the single window pane of the spare room. The cold had seeped through the thick log walls, a clean, sharp cold that was the antithesis of the stuffy, stifling rooms of Emily's past. For a moment, suspended between the troubled dark and the uncertain light, she did not know where she was. There was no scent of lavender water and waxed wood, only the faint, honest smells of wood smoke, leather, and dust. She was safe. The thought was so foreign, so fragile. It felt like a dream she was afraid to wake from. Eli was already awake. He had been for hours, sitting by the hearth, watching the gray light of dawn slowly bleed across the vast, empty land. Sleep had been a stranger. His house, a fortress of solitude for 5 long years, felt occupied. Her presence was a quiet hum beneath the familiar silence, a disturbance in the still waters of his grief. He had risen before the sun, moving with the quiet economy of a man accustomed to his own company. He'd stoked the fire, put a pot of coffee on to boil, and then he'd stopped, listening. There was no sound from her room. He pulled on his worn sheepskin coat and headed for the barn, the crunch of the frozen ground loud in the crystalline air. The sun was just beginning to crest the distant mesas, painting the underside of the clouds in shades of rose and pale orange. The world felt raw and new, a slate wiped clean by the night. The warmth and scent of the barn enveloped him, a familiar comfort of hay, animals, and earth. And then he saw her. She was standing in the center aisle, her back to him. She had taken off her ruined wedding dress and was wearing a simple, dark traveling skirt and a white blouse. Likely the only other clothes she possessed. She had found a length of burlap to use as an apron. Her hair, a cascade of dark chestnut, was loosely tied back. She was pitching hay into the stalls for his 2 geldings, her movements steady and sure. She worked not with the frantic energy of someone trying to earn her keep, but with the quiet, rhythmic competence of someone who understood the language of work. He stopped in the doorway, a ghost of a memory rising in his chest so sharply it made him ache. Sarah had moved like that. She had loved this barn, loved the simple, honest work of caring for the animals. For a dizzying moment, the silhouette in the dim light was not a stranger, but his wife, returned to him from the cold ground on the ridge. He blinked, and the illusion was gone. It was Emily, a woman he did not know, tending his animals as if she belonged there, as if she were a wife. He was surprised, a feeling so unfamiliar he almost didn't recognize it. He had expected her to be huddled in her room, a frightened bird waiting for the cage door to open. He had not expected this quiet capability. He watched as she moved to the milk cow, her hands gentle as she checked the animal's low-hanging udder. She spoke to the cow in a low murmur, a sound too soft for him to hear the words, but the tone was one of kindness. He did not stop her. He did not know what to say. To thank her would be to acknowledge a debt, and he had offered his help freely. To tell her to stop would be to reject the first sign of life she had shown, to push her back into the shadows. So he said nothing. He simply went about his own chores, moving around her in the familiar space of the barn, a silent, orbiting planet. She did not startle when she finally saw him. She simply met his gaze for a brief, unreadable moment, then turned back to her work. They moved together in the quiet of the morning. 2 people performing a domestic ritual that was both strange and deeply familiar. For Emily, the work was a balm. It was real. The pull of her muscles, the rough texture of the hay, the warm breath of the animals on her hands. It was all blessedly, mind-numbingly real. It pushed back the memories that haunted the edges of her sleepless night. The memories were of another life, one that felt like it had belonged to someone else. She was the daughter of the Reverend Michael Croft, a man whose piety was as hard and unyielding as the wooden pews of his church. Her childhood had been a world of whispered prayers, of downcast eyes, of the constant, crushing weight of her father's expectations. She was to be a testament to his virtue, a spotless lamb. There was no room in her life for joy, only for duty. Her duty, as it turned out, was to marry Nathaniel Vance, Jr., the only son of the formidable Judge Silas Vance. The judge was the most powerful man in the county, a man whose wealth and influence were matched only by his ambition. The marriage was a transaction. It would cement her father's position in the community and provide the judge with a daughter-in-law of unimpeachable piety. No one had asked Emily what she wanted. It had not occurred to them that her wants were of any consequence. Nathaniel was handsome in a cruel, polished way. In public, he was the perfect gentleman, his hand always gentle at her elbow, his smile charming, but in the moments when they were alone, his eyes held a cold, possessive gleam that terrified her. His touch was not gentle, it was an assertion of ownership. His whispers were not of affection, but of the things he would do to her, the ways he would break her quiet composure. Once she was his property. She had tried to tell her father of her fears, but he had dismissed them as maidenly hysterics. "You will learn your place, Emily," he had said, his voice cold. "Your place is to obey your husband." The wedding day had been a nightmare of white lace and suffocating flowers. She had walked down the aisle feeling like a sacrificial offering, her face hidden behind the same veil she had worn into redemption. At the reception, she watched Nathaniel drink, his laughter growing louder, his eyes on her becoming more predatory with each glass of champagne. Later, in the bridal suite, he had torn at the buttons of her dress, his breath sour with liquor. He had backed her toward the grand stone hearth, his words slurring into a stream of crude insults, telling her how he would cure her of her preacher's daughter purity. She had stumbled backward, her hands held up to ward him off. He had lunged. In her terror, she had sidestepped, and he, clumsy in his drunken rage, had tripped over a small needlepoint footstool. His momentum carried him forward. There was a sickening crack as his head struck the sharp stone corner of the hearth. He lay still. A dark pool began to spread from beneath his head. Emily stared, her mind a blank, howling void. She did not scream. She did not move to help him. The only thought that pierced through the fog of her shock was, "Run!" She had turned and fled, still in her wedding gown, taking nothing but the small valise containing her dowry and the shawl her mother had made for her. She had been running ever since. Later that morning, after the silent work in the barn was done, Eli knew he had to go to town. The storm had kept him from his supplies, and he was low on flour and salt. He hesitated to leave her. "I'm heading into redemption," he said, his voice feeling rough in the quiet of the kitchen where she was washing the breakfast plates. "I'll be back before noon." She merely nodded, her face averted. He saddled one of the geldings and rode off, the image of her standing in his kitchen, a place that had been empty of a woman's presence for so long, following him down the dusty track. Redemption was buzzing. The story of the veiled woman and the silent rancher had taken root and grown into a thorny thicket of speculation and judgment. As Eli tied his horse in front of the general store, he could feel the eyes on him, hear the whispers cease as he approached and resume as he passed. He ignored them. He was used to the town's scrutiny. It was Jed, the young boy who worked at the stables, who brought him the news. The boy ran up to him, his face pale with a mixture of fear and excitement. "Mr. McCrae," he panted, "you gotta be careful. There's men in town asking about that lady, not good men." Eli's posture straightened. "What men?" "Two of 'em. They rode in this morning. They say they're law, but they don't act like it. They work for a Judge Vance, from back east somewhere. They're looking for his son's wife, an Emily Croft." The boy's eyes were wide. They say she killed her husband on their wedding night, that she's dangerous." The words hit Eli like a punch to the gut. Emily Croft. He finally had her name, and with it, a death warrant. He thought of her in the barn, her movements so gentle. He thought of the way she had dropped her shawl, an act of trust, not aggression. Dangerous? He didn't believe it, but he knew it didn't matter what he believed. A powerful judge wanted her, and in this part of the country, a powerful man's word was the law. He cut his shopping short, grabbing only a sack of flour, his mind racing. He had to get back. He had to warn her. He rode hard, pushing his horse into a gallop. As he neared the ranch, a knot of dread tightened in his stomach. He saw her immediately. She was standing by the corral, her small valise at her feet. She had put her wedding dress back on, the veil hanging from her hand. She was preparing to run again. She must have seen the men ride into town from the ridge, or perhaps the wind itself had carried the poison of their words to her. He swung down from his horse before it had even stopped, his boots hitting the ground hard. He strode toward her, his face a grim mask. "Where do you think you're going?" he asked, his voice harsher than he intended. She flinched but did not look at him. "Away, I can't bring this trouble to your door." "It's already here." He stopped in front of her, blocking her path. "Running won't get you away from it. It will just mean you die tired." His eyes searched her face, what he could see of it around the wisps of her hair. "If you go now, you'll never stop running." Her shoulders slumped. The fight seemed to drain out of her, leaving her small and defeated. "They say I killed him," she whispered, her voice cracking. "They will hang me." "Did you?" The question was blunt, a stone thrown into the silence. She finally lifted her head, and her eyes, a deep, sorrowful brown, met his. They were filled with a pain so profound it stole his breath. "No," she said, the word barely audible. "I didn't kill anyone." She looked away then, toward the endless, unforgiving horizon. "But I don't expect you to believe me. No one will." In that moment, an inner storm, one that had been gathering in him for 5 years, broke loose. It was a storm of rage at the injustice of the world, at the way it broke the good and the gentle. It was a storm of grief for his wife, and for the woman standing before him, who was being hunted like an animal. He did not think, he acted. He reached out and took her hand. Her hand was ice cold in his, and as small as a bird's. She trembled at his touch, a violent, full-body tremor. He felt the shock of it travel up his arm, a current of shared fear and desperation. He held her hand tightly, a silent vow passing between them. He wanted to pull her closer, to shield her with his own body from the men who were coming for her. But he hesitated. The memory of Sarah, a gentle but firm barrier, stood between them. To touch this woman, to offer more than just shelter, felt like a betrayal. The tension stretched between them, a wire pulled taut to the breaking point. He let go of her hand. "Come with me," he said, his voice softer now. He led her not to the house, but to the horses. He saddled the other gelding and helped her mount, his hands respectful at her waist. He led them away from the ranch, up a steep, winding trail that climbed the mesa behind the house. They rode in silence, the only sound the clatter of the horses' hooves on the rocky path. He took her to the place, a small, wind-swept plateau that overlooked a vast, plunging canyon. The view was breathtaking and brutal. The earth fell away into a dizzying chasm of red and purple rock, carved by a river that was now just a silver thread in the distance. A single, gnarled juniper tree stood sentinel at the canyon's edge. Beneath it were 2 simple wooden crosses. One was larger, marked Sarah McCrae. The other was smaller, unmarked. Eli dismounted and walked to the graves, removing his hat. Emily slid down from her horse and followed him, her steps hesitant. "This is where I buried her," he said, his voice low, addressed more to the canyon than to Emily. "My Sarah, and our boy." He touched the larger cross with his fingertips. "She was strong, stronger than me in a lot of ways. But the fever, it didn't care how strong she was." He turned to look at Emily, his blue eyes clear and filled with a sorrow that mirrored her own. "This land," he said, gesturing to the immense, beautiful, and cruel landscape before them. "It sees everything. It remembers the blood that's been spilled, the tears that have been shed. It doesn't forget." He paused, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in her fear, her exhaustion, her quiet strength. "But it forgives. It has to. Otherwise, nothing new could ever grow." He was not just talking about the land. He was talking about them. He was offering her a kind of absolution, a permission to stop running, not just from the law, but from the guilt and the shame that were her constant companions. He was telling her that he saw her, not as a murderess, but as a survivor, just like him. Tears she had refused to shed for weeks finally spilled over, tracking clean paths through the dust on her cheeks. She did not sob. She cried in silence, a grief too deep for sound. That night, the house was no longer just a shelter. It was a crucible. The emotional weight between them had become a living thing, a palpable presence in the small, fire-lit room. They ate a simple meal of bread and beans, the silence charged with all the things they had not said on the ridge. Every accidental brush of their hands was an electric shock. Every shared glance was a deep, unspoken question. After the meal, she stood by the fire, her arms wrapped around herself as if to keep from flying apart. He could see her trembling, the fear of the coming day, the raw emotion of the afternoon. It was all too much. The carefully constructed walls she had built around herself were crumbling. He moved to stand behind her, not touching, but close enough that she could feel the heat from his body. He wanted to offer comfort, a simple human gesture, but he knew that once he touched her, there would be no going back. The boundaries they had silently respected would be gone. He lifted a hand, his fingers tracing the line of her shoulder through the thin fabric of her blouse. She stiffened, a sharp intake of breath, but she did not pull away. Her trembling intensified. He rested his palm on her back, a slow, gentle, silent pressure. He felt the frantic beating of her heart beneath his hand. She turned slowly to face him. Her face, in the flickering firelight, was a mask of fear and longing. Her eyes were wide, luminous with unshed tears. Her lips were parted as if to speak, but no words came. He brought his other hand up to cup her face, his thumb gently stroking her cheekbone. Her skin was soft, chilled. Her hands, which had been clenched at her sides, slowly uncurled. They did not push him away. They did not resist. They rose and rested hesitantly against his chest, her fingers clutching his shirt as if he were the only solid thing in a collapsing world. Their passion, when it came, was not a gentle unfolding. It was an eruption, a breaking of a dam that had held back years of loneliness and grief and fear. It was a collision of two souls starved for contact, for a moment of oblivion. He lowered his head and kissed her, and it was a kiss of desperation, of shared pain. It was the kiss of a man who had forgotten what it felt like to be alive, and a woman who had never been allowed to live. It was a crossing of unspoken boundaries, a desperate, reckless gamble in the heart of the unforgiving West. And as their bodies tangled in the quiet surrender of the night, neither of them knew if they were finding salvation or simply a more profound way to be lost. The morning after was a world of quiet edges and soft light. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the house was filled with a stillness that was different from the solitude of before. It was a shared silence now, threaded with a new, fragile awareness. When Emily emerged from her room, dressed again in the simple skirt and blouse, she found Eli sitting at the kitchen table, a steaming mug of coffee in his hands. He looked up as she entered, and for a moment, the air was thick with the unspoken memory of the night. He did not speak of it, nor did she. Instead, he gave a small nod toward the stove. "There's coffee." It was the beginning of a subtle shift, a delicate thaw in the frozen landscape of their lives. Over the next few days, a tentative peace settled over the small ranch. Eli, a man who had wrapped himself in silence for 5 years, began to talk. He spoke not of his grief or his past, but of the land. He told her the names of the distant mesas, showed her where the hawks nested in the spring, explained the rhythm of the seasons in this harsh, beautiful country. His words were simple, practical, but they were a bridge built across the chasm of their loneliness. And Emily, who had lived in a world where her voice was an unwelcome sound, began to respond. At first, it was just a nod or a soft hum of acknowledgement. Then, a quiet question. "What is that flower called?" she asked one afternoon, pointing to a stubborn purple blossom pushing its way through the hard-packed earth. "Indian paintbrush," he'd answered, and the way he looked at her when she spoke, as if her voice were a rare and precious thing, made a warmth bloom in her chest. Once, while they were mending a fence line under the vast, empty sky, he told a dry, funny story about a stubborn mule he'd once owned. She'd looked at him, a genuine and unexpected amusement in her eyes, and the corner of her mouth had lifted in a faint, hesitant curve. It was not quite a smile, but it was the promise of one. It transformed her face, erasing for a fleeting second the haunted look in her eyes. Eli saw it and felt something in his own chest shift, something he had thought long dead and buried with Sarah. They worked side by side, falling into a natural rhythm. The ranch, which had been a place of solitary labor for Eli, became a place of shared tasks. He would find she had already fed the chickens or filled the water trough. She would find he had left a bucket of fresh, clean water for her by the door. These small, unspoken acts of care were a language all their own, but their peace was as fragile as a desert flower, and they both knew it. The threat of Judge Vance and his men was a constant, low rumble on the horizon, a storm that had not yet broken but was surely coming. In redemption, the gossip had festered. The story of the mysterious bride and the reclusive widower had soured into something ugly and mean-spirited. The two men hired by Judge Vance, a pair of hard-faced men named Boone and Croker, made the saloon their headquarters. They drank the judge's money and spread their poison, painting Emily as a black widow, a dangerous seductress who had murdered her husband in cold blood. They offered a reward for any information on her whereabouts, and the sum was large enough to turn a desperate man's head. Jebediah Jeb Stone was such a man, a lanky, sallow-faced ranch hand with shifty eyes and a perpetual grievance against the world. Jeb had worked for Eli on and off over the years. He knew Eli's land, knew his habits. He also harbored a bitter jealousy toward the man. He envied Eli's ranch, his quiet strength, and now he envied him the woman who was the subject of so much fevered speculation. One afternoon, Jeb was in the saloon, drowning his resentments in cheap whiskey, when he overheard Boone and Croker talking. They were growing impatient. The judge was on his way, and they had yet to find the girl. The reward money was mentioned again, a figure that made Jeb's breath catch in his throat. It was more money than he had ever seen in his life, enough to leave this dusty, dead-end town and start over somewhere else. He drained his glass, the whiskey burning a trail of reckless courage down to his gut. He wiped his mouth on his sleeve and sidled up to their table. "You fellas looking for that woman?" he asked, trying to sound casual. Boone looked him up and down with contempt. "What's it to you?" "I might know where she is," Jeb said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Holed up with that McCrae fella, out at his place on the edge of the Badlands." Croker's eyes lit up with a predator's gleam. He slid a few silver dollars across the table toward Jeb. "This is for the information," he said, his voice a low growl. "There'll be more for you if it proves true, a lot more. But if you're lying—" He let the threat hang in the air, unfinished but perfectly understood. Jeb snatched the coins, his hand trembling slightly. "I ain't lying," he stammered, and scurried out of the saloon, the weight of his betrayal already heavy in his pocket. A few days later, Eli realized he needed to go to town for a new buckle for a broken harness. He was reluctant to leave. The fragile peace in his home felt too precious to be left unguarded. "I'll be back before sundown," he told Emily as he saddled his horse. He looked at her, standing in the doorway of the house, a dish towel in her hands. She looked almost as if she belonged there. The thought was both comforting and terrifying. "Be safe, Eli," she said, the words so soft he almost missed them. It was the first time she had used his name. It settled in his heart with a surprising warmth. He nodded, unable to speak, and rode away, turning back once to see her still standing in the doorway, watching him go. He conducted his business in town quickly, his unease growing with every passing minute. He avoided the saloon, ignoring the hostile stares that followed him down the street as he rode out of town. The afternoon sun was warm on his back, but a cold finger of dread was tracing its way down his spine. He saw the smoke first, a thin gray plume rising from the direction of his ranch. It was not the gentle wisp of a chimney. It was too dark, too thick. He spurred his horse into a frantic gallop, his heart pounding against his ribs. The scene that greeted him was one of violated peace. The front door of his house was splintered, hanging crookedly on one hinge. The inside had been ransacked. Furniture was overturned. Drawers were pulled out and their contents scattered across the floor. In the kitchen, the crockery Sarah had so carefully painted was smashed to pieces. It was a vicious, deliberate desecration. He searched the house, his calls of Emily swallowed by the terrible silence. She was not there. The fire in the hearth had been scattered. the source of the smoke he had seen. In the middle of the floor, half hidden under an overturned table, was her shawl. It was trampled and dirty, a single, heartbreaking piece of evidence. He picked it up, the fine wool impossibly soft in his calloused hands, and a cold, killing rage unlike anything he had ever known settled deep in his bones. He saw the tracks of 2 shod horses leading away from the ranch, heading back toward redemption. They had taken her. He did not waste time on grief or despair. He walked with a calm, deadly purpose to the barn, saddled his best horse, and checked the loads in his Winchester. Then he mounted and rode for town, a solitary figure of vengeance against the backdrop of the setting sun. He stormed into the sheriff's office without knocking. Sheriff Miller, a man whose authority came more from his badge than his backbone, looked up from his paperwork, his face pale and sweating. Boone and Croker were there, leaning against the wall, their expressions a mixture of triumph and arrogance. "Where is she?" Eli's voice was dangerously quiet, a low rumble that promised violence. Sheriff Miller cleared his throat, avoiding Eli's gaze. "Now, Eli, calm down. The woman is in my custody, where she belongs." "On what charge?" Eli demanded, his eyes fixed on the smug faces of the judge's men. "On the charge of murder," Boone said, pushing himself off the wall. "She's wanted for the murder of her husband, Nathaniel Vance, Jr." "She's had no trial. You have no proof," Eli shot back, his hands clenching into fists. "We have the word of Judge Vance himself," the sheriff said, his voice gaining a weak authority. "And he's on his way now. He'll be here in a day or 2 to oversee the formalities." "Formalities?" Eli's laugh was a harsh, bitter sound. "You mean the hanging? That's the usual punishment for murder?" Croker sneered. "The judge wants this done proper and legal." Eli knew it was hopeless. He had no standing here. He was just a rancher. She was a stranger, against the power and wealth of a judge. Their words, their rights, meant nothing. The law in redemption was whatever the most powerful man said it was, and he had no power at all. In the dark, dank cell behind the sheriff's office, Emily sat on a thin, lumpy mattress, her body numb with cold and fear. The memory she had been running from for so long had finally caught her, and now it played over and over in her mind, sharp and vivid in the darkness. She was back in the bridal suite, the scent of lilies and champagne thick in the air. Nathaniel was advancing on her, his handsome face twisted into a mask of drunken cruelty. "I'll show you what it means to be a wife," he'd snarled, his hand shooting out to grab the bodice of her dress. The fine lace ripped with a sound that was like a scream. She had scrambled backward, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. He was laughing, a low, ugly sound. "Don't be shy, my little saint. I'm going to enjoy teaching you the ways of the world." He had lunged for her again, his feet tangling in the small needlepoint footstool that sat before the hearth. She had flinched away, and in that same instant, he had pitched forward. His head had struck the sharp corner of the stone mantelpiece with a horrifying, final crack. The laughter stopped. The silence that fell was absolute, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the mantel. He did not move. She had stared at his still form, at the dark blood beginning to pool on the white marble, and a terror colder and more profound than any she had ever known had seized her. It was not guilt. It was the certain knowledge of her fate. She, a preacher's daughter with no name or power of her own, would be accused of murdering the son of the most powerful man in the county. No one would listen. No one would believe her. Her only choice had been to run. A key rattled in the lock, and Sheriff Miller entered, carrying a plate of stale bread and a tin cup of water. As he set it on the floor, Emily could hear a man's voice from the outer office, low and furious. Eli's voice. He was here. He had come for her. A wave of despair and a fierce, protective instinct washed over her. He could not save her, but he could be destroyed for trying. She had to send him away. "Sheriff," she said, her voice hoarse but clear. The sheriff looked at her, surprised she had spoken. "That man out there," she continued, her gaze steady. "Tell him to go home. Tell him he is mistaken. I do not know him." Her voice broke on the last words, but she forced herself to go on. "He doesn't owe me anything." The sheriff stared at her for a long moment, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Then he shrugged and left, locking the door behind him. Emily sank back onto the cot, the tears finally coming, silent and hot in the suffocating darkness. Out in the office, the sheriff delivered her message to Eli, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "You heard the man. Eli, the lady says to let her be. Says she doesn't know you." Eli looked past the sheriff, toward the barred door of the cell. He knew she was lying. She was trying to protect him. She was facing a hangman's noose, and her first thought was to keep him from harm. The knowledge settled not as a defeat, but as a resolve, hard and pure as steel. If the law would not help her, if the town would not stand for her, then he would. He turned without another word and walked out of the office. He did not go home to his empty, broken house. He walked to the general store, then to the livery. He moved with a quiet purpose that drew the attention of the town. People peeked out from behind their curtains, their faces a mixture of fear and curiosity. He returned to the center of the dusty street as dusk began to fall, casting long shadows from the false-fronted buildings. He walked to the covered boardwalk directly across from the sheriff's office and the courthouse. In his hands, he carried his old Sharps rifle from the war, its long barrel gleaming dully in the fading light. He did not load it. He did not aim it. He did not shout or make threats. He simply leaned the rifle against the post of the boardwalk, folded his arms across his chest, and stood there, his back straight, his gaze fixed on the jailhouse window. He stood alone, a silent sentinel in the encroaching night. He was a man with nothing left to lose, making his stand. The wind picked up, swirling dust around his worn boots, but he did not move. He would not leave until she was free. The night was a long, dark river, and Emily felt herself drowning in its slow, cold current. She sat on the cot in her cell. The world shrunk to the dimensions of this stone box. Through the small, barred window, she could see a slice of the street and the single, unmoving figure of Eli McCrae. He had not left his post. He stood like a statue carved from the prairie itself, a silent, solitary testament to a loyalty she felt she had not earned. The town had gone quiet. The raucous noise from the saloon had died down, and the lights in the houses had been extinguished one by one, leaving only the cold, distant stars and the warm, defiant glow of the lantern Eli had placed at his feet. Judge Silas Vance had arrived that evening, his carriage a black, ominous beetle rolling into town. He had not come alone. A half-dozen more men, their faces hard and their guns worn high, had come with him. The trial, set for the morning, was a formality. Her fate had been sealed the moment Nathaniel Vance had drawn his last breath. She was not afraid of dying. In a way, she had been dying a little every day for years, suffocated by her father's piety and her husband's cruelty. What she feared was the shame. She would hang as a murderess, her name a curse, her memory a scandal. And she feared for Eli. He was a good man, a quiet man who had shown her a kindness she had forgotten existed. For that kindness, he would be ruined. Or worse, she had tried to send him away, but his stubborn silence was a force more powerful than her words. A faint scratching sound at the back of the cell pulled her from her dark thoughts. She looked toward the small, high window on the rear wall, a grimy pane of glass that looked out onto a dark alley. The scratching came again, more insistent this time. She stood, her heart beginning a slow, heavy drumbeat. A thin knife blade slid between the window frame and the wall, working at the rusted lock. After a moment of grating and squealing, the lock gave way, The windows swung inward on creaking hinges. A boy's head appeared in the opening. It was Jed, the stable boy, his face pale in the moonlight. "Miss Croft," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Mr. McCrae sent me." Before she could respond, a pair of strong hands gripped the window frame, and Eli hauled himself up and through the opening. He landed silently on the stone floor, his tall frame seeming to fill the small cell. He turned and gave Jed a quiet nod. The boy's head disappeared, and the window was gently pulled shut. Eli turned to face her. In the dim light filtering from the street, his face was a landscape of shadows, his eyes holding a fierce, steady light. He did not look like a man who had been standing vigil for hours. He looked like a man preparing for a war. "Eli," she breathed, her voice a fragile thing. "You shouldn't be here. If they find you—" "They won't," he said, his voice a low rumble. He looked around the cell, his gaze taking in the damp stone, the thin mattress, the bucket in the corner. A muscle clenched in his jaw. "This is no place for you." He moved closer, stopping just before the bars that separated the main cell from the small antechamber. He had a small bundle in his hand. "I brought you something, water and some bread. You need your strength." He passed the bundle through the bars. Her fingers brushed his as she took it, and the brief contact was like a bolt of lightning, a sudden, sharp reminder of the life that was about to be extinguished. "Thank you," she whispered. He did not offer platitudes. He did not tell her everything would be all right. He looked at her, his gaze direct and unwavering, and it felt as if he were seeing straight into the battered, terrified core of her soul. "I can get you out of here," he said, his voice even. "Jed has a horse saddled and waiting a mile out of town. We can be across the territorial line before they even know you're gone. You could have a new life, a new name. No one would ever find you." He was offering her the one thing she had craved: escape, freedom, a chance to run so far that the ghosts of her past could never catch her. She could feel the pull of it, the desperate, seductive promise of a clean slate. She looked at his face, at the earnest and solemn offer in his eyes. He would do it. He would risk everything to save her. But as she looked at him, she also saw the ranch, the quiet companionship of the barn in the morning, the way the sun set over the canyon where his wife was buried. She remembered his words, "If you go now, you'll never stop running." She had been running her whole life, running from her father's expectations, from her husband's cruelty, from the consequences of that terrible night. Running had left her breathless and alone. She was tired. She was so very tired of running. Eli watched her, his silence a patient, waiting thing. He did not press her. He had made his offer. The choice was hers. He was not asking her to run with him. He was asking her what she wanted. "Eli," she began, her voice gaining a strength she did not know she possessed. She looked him straight in the eye, the bars between them feeling like a symbol of all the barriers she had lived behind. "He was a monster, my husband. He was cruel, and he hurt people. Not just me, he hurt anyone who was weaker than him." The words tumbled out, a confession she had never dared to speak aloud. "That night, he was drunk. He came at me, and he was going to hurt me badly. I was afraid he was going to kill me." She took a shuddering breath. "He tripped. He fell and hit his head. I never touched him, but I was glad he was dead." The final admission hung in the air, a terrible, liberating truth. "I was glad." Eli's expression did not change. There was no shock, no judgment in his eyes, only a deep, quiet understanding. He had offered her a chance to run, but in his gaze, she saw another question, a harder one. He did not ask if she wanted to be saved. He asked if she was ready to save herself. He reached a hand through the bars, not to touch her, but as an offering. "They will twist your words. The judge will own the sheriff, the jury, the whole town. They won't give you a fair hearing. If we run, you live. If you stay, He did not need to finish the sentence. She looked at his strong, calloused hand, then back to his eyes. She thought of the shame she had carried, the fear that had been her constant companion. To run would be to let that shame win. It would be an admission of guilt. It would mean that Nathaniel Vance, even in death, still had power over her. "I have a question for you. Emily Croft," he said, his voice dropping lower, each word imbued with a solemn weight. He didn't ask if she was innocent. He didn't ask if she wanted to run. He asked, "Do you want to stay and fight?" The question struck her with the force of a physical blow. Fight. It was a word that had never been a part of her vocabulary. She had been taught to endure, to submit, to pray, but never to fight. The idea was terrifying. And yet, it was also the first breath of clean, fresh air she had taken in her life. To fight meant to stand up, to speak the truth, to claim her own life as her own, even if it meant losing it. She looked at Eli, at this quiet, steadfast man who believed in her without proof, who offered her not just escape, but a chance at dignity. And she knew her answer. "I'm tired of running," she said, her voice clear and steady. A slow nod was his only reply. A pact had been made in the darkness of the cell. He withdrew his hand and, with a final, long look, he turned and disappeared back out the window as silently as he had come. The next morning, the sun rose on a town holding its breath. The makeshift courtroom in the largest room of the town hall was packed to overflowing. Every man, woman, and child who could fit had crammed inside, their face a sea of morbid curiosity. At the front of the room, on a raised platform, sat Judge Silas Vance. He was a man in his late 60s, with a face like a hawk and eyes as cold and gray as river stones. He exuded an aura of absolute, unshakable authority. He was not here to find justice. He was here to deliver a verdict he had already decided upon. When the bailiff called her name, the crowd stirred. A low murmur rippling through the room. The door opened, and Sheriff Miller let her in. But the woman who entered was not the one they had expected. She was not the veiled, spectral figure who had arrived in the dust storm. She was not a cowering, weeping girl. Emily walked with her head held high. She had taken off the veil. Her dark hair was neatly pinned, and her face, though pale and marked by exhaustion, was composed and proud. She wore the simple traveling dress, clean and mended. Her eyes, clear and direct, swept over the crowd, over the jury of nervous, intimidated ranchers, and finally came to rest on Judge Vance. She did not flinch from his malevolent glare. A gasp went through the room. This was not the face of a murderess. It was the face of a lady, a preacher's daughter, and it was a face that held a quiet, defiant strength that no one had anticipated. She took her seat, her back ramrod straight, and waited. Eli stood at the back of the room, his arms crossed, his presence a silent, immovable mountain. The trial was a farce. The prosecutor, a man in the judge's pay, painted a lurid picture of a cold-hearted, manipulative woman who had ensnared the judge's beloved son, only to murder him for his inheritance on their wedding night. Boone and Croker were called to testify, their lies smooth and practiced. They spoke of finding Nathaniel's body, of Emily's flight, twisting every fact into a thread for the hangman's rope. When it was the defense's turn, her appointed lawyer, a young, terrified man who had been thoroughly intimidated by the judge, offered only a weak, stammering protest. It was then that the courtroom door creaked open again. An old woman stood there, her body stooped with age, her face a web of wrinkles. She was dressed in the plain black dress of a servant. It was Martha, a woman who had been the head maid in the Vance household for over 30 years. "I have something to say," she announced, her voice thin but surprisingly clear. Cutting through the tense silence, Judge Vance's face darkened. "This is highly irregular. You were not called as a witness." "Maybe I should have been," Martha said, walking slowly but purposefully toward the witness stand. "There are things this court needs to hear." The judge began to protest, but a murmur was growing in the crowd. They were intrigued. This was better than the one-sided story they had been fed. With a look of fury, the judge relented, waving a dismissive hand. "Be quick about it, woman." Martha took the stand and swore the oath. She looked not at the judge, but at the jury. "I knew Nathaniel Vance since he was a boy," she began, her voice gaining strength. "And I knew his temper. The boy was cruel. I saw him, with my own eyes, break the wing of his pet canary because it would not sing for him. I saw him whip a stable boy for accidentally scuffing his new boots. As he grew into a man, that cruelty, it grew with him. He had a taste for hurting things that couldn't fight back." A shocked silence fell over the courtroom. Martha's gaze shifted to Emily. "I saw him with this girl in the days before the wedding. He was not a loving fiancé. His touch was a pinch, not a caress. His whispers were threats. I saw a bruise on her arm, the shape of a man's fingers, the day before the wedding. She told me she had bumped into a door." The old woman's eyes filled with tears. "I stayed silent. I was afraid of the judge, afraid of losing my position. But I will not stay silent while an innocent girl hangs for that boy's wickedness." The courtroom erupted. The carefully constructed narrative of the grieving father and the villainous bride had been shattered. Judge Vance was on his feet, his face purple with rage, his authority crumbling before his eyes. He was humiliated. Before the judge could restore order, Eli stepped forward from the back of the room. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it carried to every corner, shaking with a raw, powerful emotion. "I have something to say as well." All eyes turned to him. "I'm the man who took this woman in. I didn't know her name. I didn't know her story. I only knew what I saw." He looked directly at the jury, his gaze locking with each of theirs in turn. "I saw a woman who had been through a storm, and I offered her shelter. That first night, when we reached my home, she stood on my porch. She took off her shawl, and she dropped it in the dust without a word." He paused, his throat working. "And I saw more courage in that one simple, silent act than in any man I have ever known. It was the courage of someone with nothing left to lose, who was willing to trust a stranger rather than face the world's judgment alone. That is not the act of a killer. It is the act of a survivor." The room was utterly still. Eli's simple, heartfelt words had done what no lawyer could have. He had shown them not the evidence, but the truth of her character. The jury filed out. They were gone for less than 10 minutes. When they returned, the foreman, a weathered old rancher, refused to look at Judge Vance. He looked instead at Emily. "We find the defendant, Emily Croft," he announced, his voice ringing with conviction. "Not guilty." A collective gasp, then a wave of shouts and applause swept through the room. Emily sagged in her chair, a sob of pure, unadulterated relief escaping her lips. Eli was at her side in an instant, his hand on her shoulder. But Judge Vance was not defeated. He rose to his full height, his face a mask of cold fury. His voice cut through the noise like a shard of ice. "This is a travesty of justice," he hissed. "And it is not over. I will have my vengeance on all of you." The crowd began to file out, casting nervous glances at the enraged judge. Eli guided Emily through the throng, shielding her with his body. They had just reached the courthouse steps, blinking in the bright afternoon sun, when the chaos erupted. A man lunged from the crowd, a man Emily didn't recognize. In his hand was a pistol, its dark eye aimed directly at her heart. There was no time to think. Eli reacted on pure instinct. He shoved Emily behind him, spinning to face the threat just as the gun fired. The sound was deafening, a sharp crack that echoed off the building fronts. Emily saw Eli's body jolt, a look of shocked surprise on his face. A dark red stain blossomed on the shoulder of his shirt. He staggered but did not fall, his eyes still fixed on her. Men in the crowd tackled the shooter, wrestling the gun from his hand. People were screaming, but for Emily, the world narrowed to the sight of Eli, wounded, bleeding, because of her. She rushed to him, her hands coming up to grip his arms, to hold him up. He swayed, his face pale. "Eli!" she choked out, her heart seizing with a new and terrible fear. He looked down at her, a faint, pained smile on his lips. "Told you this town was trouble," he murmured. She pressed her forehead to his. The world outside, the shouts, the chaos, fading to a dull roar. All that mattered was the man in front of her. The steady beat of his heart she could feel through his chest. She had just won her life back. She would not lose him now. "Don't you dare die," she whispered, her voice a fierce, trembling command. "Not now." The world dissolved into a blur of sound and pain. Eli was vaguely aware of being half-carried, half-dragged through a chaotic sea of shouting faces. He felt the rough hands of strangers on him, the jostle of movement, the sharp, lancing fire in his shoulder that seemed to radiate through his entire body. Through the gray haze of shock, one thing remained in sharp focus: Emily's face, her eyes wide with a terror that was entirely for him. Her desperate whisper, "Don't you dare die," was an anchor in the storm, a command he clung to as darkness frayed the edges of his vision. He surfaced to the reek of whiskey and carbolic acid. He was lying on a narrow cot in the back room of Doc Adams's office. The town's physician and undertaker, the doc, a man with a perpetually grim expression and hands stained with a history of other people's misfortunes, was probing the wound with a pair of steel forceps. The pain was a white-hot agony that made Eli's vision swim. He gritted his teeth, a low groan escaping his lips. "Hold still, McCrae," the doctor grunted, not unkindly. "You're lucky. Bullet went clean through, missed the bone, but you'll be carrying that arm in a sling for a good long while." Emily stood in the corner of the room, her back pressed against the wall. Her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles were white. She watched every movement, every flicker of pain on Eli's face, her own expression a mask of anguish and guilt. This was her fault. The bullet had been meant for her. This good, quiet man was bleeding on a cot in a dusty back room because he had stood in front of her. Doc Adams finished binding the wound, his movements efficient and practiced. "He'll have a fever," he said, wiping his hands on a stained rag. "You'll need to keep him warm and spoon broth into him when he can take it, and keep that bandage clean. I'll ride out in a few days to check on him." He looked from Eli's pale, sweat-sheened face to Emily's. "You'll be able to get him home?" "Yes," she said, her voice surprisingly firm. "I will." The journey back to the ranch was a slow, torturous ordeal. Jed, the stable boy, his young face etched with worry, helped Emily get Eli into the back of his own wagon, laid out on a bed of hay sacks. Every jolt and rut in the road sent a fresh wave of agony through Eli, and Emily sat beside him, her hand resting lightly on his uninjured arm, murmuring quiet, soothing words she didn't know she had in her. When they finally reached the ranch, the sight of the ransacked house was a fresh wound, but there was no time for despair. With Jed's help, she managed to get Eli inside and into his own bed, after the boy had left, promising to look after the townside chores. Emily was truly alone with the devastating aftermath. Eli had drifted into a feverish, restless sleep, his breathing shallow. The house was a cold, chaotic mess, and the vast, silent prairie outside seemed to press in on her, a profound and terrifying loneliness. For the next few weeks, the ranch became a sick room, and Emily became its sole, tireless nurse. The life she had known, a life of needlepoint and quiet contemplation, had not prepared her for this. She learned to boil water and tear sheets for bandages, her hands, once soft and pale, becoming chapped and raw. She learned to clean the wound, her stomach churning at the sight of blood and torn flesh. her hands trembling as she forced herself to be gentle but firm. She learned to cook a thin, nourishing broth and spoon it between Eli's cracked lips when he was lucid. She moved through the broken house with a grim determination, while Eli slept. She set the furniture back on its feet, swept up the shattered remains of his wife's crockery, and scrubbed the floors until her back ached. She was reclaiming the space, not just from the intruders, but from the ghosts that lingered there. She was making it a place of healing, a sanctuary. Eli's fever raged for days. He tossed and turned, caught in a delirium that took him far away from her. He muttered names she didn't know, spoke of battles and cattle drives, and sometimes, in a voice thick with a sorrow that broke her heart, he would murmur a single name: Sarah. In those moments, Emily would retreat, feeling like an intruder in his private grief. She would stand by the window, her arms wrapped around herself, and watch the world outside begin to change. The vibrant ochres and golds of autumn faded to a uniform, somber brown. The wind developed a new, sharper edge, and then, one morning, she woke to a world transformed. A thick blanket of snow had fallen during the night, silencing the landscape, smoothing its harsh contours into gentle, sweeping curves of white. Winter had arrived. The snow both isolated them and drew them closer. The world shrank to the four walls of the small house, the vast prairie, a distant, frozen sea. As Eli's fever broke and he began the slow, painful journey back to consciousness, they fell into a new, quiet rhythm. They became something like a couple, bound not by vows or promises, but by the shared trauma of survival. His weakness forced an intimacy between them that was both tender and awkward. She had to help him sit up, change his bandages, bring him his food. Her hands, which had trembled with fear at first, grew steady and sure, and he, a man of fierce independence, had to learn to accept her help. He watched her as she moved about the cabin, her presence a quiet, constant source of warmth in the cold, winter-bound house. The silence that had once sat between them, heavy with unspoken pain, was now filled with a different kind of quiet, a shared understanding, a fragile peace. But fear was a constant, unseen guest at their hearth. They both knew Judge Vance would not be deterred by a courtroom verdict. The man who had tried to shoot her had been one of the judge's hired men, a fact the sheriff had conveniently overlooked. They were living on borrowed time, and the endless white expanse outside their window felt less like a pristine blanket and more like a closing trap. One night, weeks after the shooting, the wind howled around the corners of the house, a mournful, lonely sound. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Emily had been mending one of Eli's shirts, her fingers working with a new, practiced skill. Eli, who had been dozing in his armchair, a blanket tucked around him, stirred. She looked up and found him awake, his gaze fixed on the flames, his expression distant and troubled. She set her sewing aside and went to kneel by his chair. "Are you in pain?" she asked softly. He shook his head, not looking at her. He was silent for a long time, the only sounds the wind and the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low murmur, rough with disuse and a deep, weary sadness. "You could have left," he said. It was not an accusation. It was a statement of fact, filled with a kind of pained wonder. "After the trial, you were free. You could have taken a horse and been 100 miles from here by now. Away from all this. Away from me." Emily looked at his profile in the firelight, at the new lines of pain and exhaustion etched around his eyes. She thought of his offer in the jail cell, the chance to run, to disappear. She thought of the life she could have had, a life of quiet anonymity, free from the shadow of Judge Vance. It would have been a life of running, a life of looking over her shoulder. But it would have been a life. She had stayed and watched him suffer, tended to his wound, and lived in the heart of the dangers she had brought to his door. She could have left him. Any sane person would have. She reached out and placed her hand on his, which rested on the arm of the chair. His skin was cool, his fingers long and strong. "You said stay the night," she answered, her voice steady and clear in the quiet room. "I'm still staying." He turned his head then and looked at her. His blue eyes, clear and searching, held hers in their depths. She saw not just gratitude, but something deeper, something that mirrored the fierce, protective tenderness that had taken root in her own heart. He had not just offered her a place to stay, he had offered her a place to stand her ground, and she had chosen to stand with him. He lifted his good hand and gently touched her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. The simple, tender gesture spoke more than words ever could. It was an acknowledgement, an acceptance, a silent agreement. The tension and fear that had been their constant companions seemed to recede, pushed back by the warmth of the fire and the profound, quiet intimacy of the moment. She leaned into his touch, and he guided her face toward his. Their kiss was nothing like the desperate, fevered collision of their first night together. This was slow, deliberate, a deep and gentle exploration. There was no rush, there was no guilt. It was a quiet surrender, a confirmation of the vow she had just made. He drew her from the floor into his lap, his embrace careful of his wounded shoulder, their bodies tangled in the warm flicker of the firelight, a slow, deep current of emotion passing between them. It was a healing, a rediscovery of a language their bodies had almost forgotten. It was two lonely, broken souls finding not just passion, but a profound and quiet solace in each other's arms. The fragile peace of their sanctuary was shattered a week later by the arrival of a lone rider. It was Silas Blackwood, an old, grizzled rancher whose land bordered Eli's to the north. Silas was a man of the old school, carved from the same hard earth as Eli, and one of the few neighbors who hadn't treated Eli with suspicion after the trial. He sat at their kitchen table, a mug of hot coffee warming his gnarled hands, his face grim. "Came to warn you, Eli," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Word's come down from Redemption. The judge ain't given up. He's put a bounty out." Eli, now able to move around the house with his arm in a sling, stiffened. "A bounty on me?" Silas shook his head, his expression grim. "Worse, a bounty on your land. He's offering $500 in gold to any man or group of men who can run you off this ranch. He wants you broken. He wants you left with nothing." The insidious cruelty of the plan settled like a killing frost in the room. Judge Vance was not just seeking vengeance. He was using his wealth to turn the entire territory against them. $500 was a fortune, enough to tempt any desperate man. "He's claiming the land is his," Silas continued, "as restitution for his son's inconvenience. It's a lie, of course, but he's filed papers with the territorial marshal. He's twisting the law to his own ends." The news spread through the territory like a prairie fire. Men who had once nodded to Eli in town now looked away. The few neighbors who had been friendly now stayed clear of his property lines. They were afraid of the judge's power, and tempted by his gold. They were utterly, completely alone. Only Silas Blackwood remained a friend, riding over every few days with the news in a shared, grim determination. Eli grew more withdrawn, a dark, helpless anger simmering in him. He would stand at the window for hours, his good hand clenched into a fist, and stare out at the snow-covered land that had been his life's work. It was all he had left, and now it was a target. Emily watched him, her heart aching with a fierce, protective love. She would not let this happen. She would not let the judge destroy this man who had saved her. She refused to be a victim, a passive bystander in the destruction of their life. But what could she do? They had no money, no allies, and the law was against them. One afternoon, while Eli was out in the barn, his movements slow and pained as he tried to do some small chores, Emily found herself tidying the small spare room where she had first slept. She picked up her old valise, the one she had carried with her on her flight. It was the last remnant of her old life, a life she wanted to forget. She opened it, intending to see if there was anything worth salvaging. Inside, beneath her spare dress, was a small, heavy cloth bag tied with a leather thong. It was her dowry, a collection of gold coins her father had given her, a small fortune meant to secure her future as Mrs. Nathaniel Vance. She had forgotten all about it in the chaos of her flight and the turmoil that followed. She poured the coins out onto the bed. They gleamed in the pale winter light, a small pile of silent, powerful potential. There were 20 double eagle gold coins, $400. It was a fortune. It was enough to buy her passage to anywhere in the world. She could take it and disappear, leave Eli and his troubles behind, and start a new life where no one knew the name Emily Croft. She stared at the gold, the key to her freedom, glittering on the patchwork quilt, and she thought of Eli, his face pale with pain, his quiet strength, the gentle way he touched her in the night. She thought of his words by his wife's grave. This land, it forgives. It has to. Otherwise, nothing new could ever grow. She scooped the coins back into the bag, her decision made, hard and clear as ice. This was not the price of her escape. This was the price of their survival. She would not run. She would fight. This gold would not buy her a new life somewhere else. It would buy them a chance to defend the life they were building here. She would use it to hire men. Good men, gunslingers if she had to. They would not be run off their land. Judge Vance had started a war, and Emily Croft, the preacher's daughter, was going to finish it. The winter held on with a grim, stubborn tenacity, but by late March, the first signs of its surrender began to appear. The snow receded from the south-facing slopes, revealing the damp, dark earth beneath. The icy grip on the creek loosened, and the sound of running water returned, a quiet, insistent murmur of life. It was a false spring, a season of hope and dread. With the thawing of the land came the thawing of the roads, and they both knew that Judge Vance's men would not be far behind. Emily's gold changed everything. It transformed their helpless waiting into a period of determined preparation. Silas Blackwood, his loyalty as solid as the granite of the mesas, was their link to the outside world. He took a portion of the gold and rode out, not to redemption, but to the outlying homesteads and mining camps, seeking men who valued a man's character more than a rich man's lies. He returned with 3. They were not gunfighters, but they were not men who would back down. There was Tom, a young, quiet homesteader who had lost his own land to a crooked speculator, a grizzled, one-eyed ex-prospector named Gus, who was fiercely loyal to Silas, and a Mexican vaquero called Mateo, whose skill with a horse and a rifle was legendary in the territory. They were not an army, but they were a start, and they were led by a woman who had found a strength she never knew she possessed. It was Emily who walked the perimeter of the ranch with them, her gaze sharp and analytical, having learned the contours of the land from Eli during the long winter months. She pointed out the natural defenses, the rocky outcrop that provided cover, the narrow wash that would funnel any approaching riders, the high ridge that offered a perfect vantage point. Eli watched her, his heart a mixture of pride and a deep, aching fear for her safety. His shoulder was healing, but a deep ache was a constant reminder of his new limitations. He was no longer the man he had been. He could shoot, but he could not move with the speed or strength the coming fight would demand. He taught her to use the Winchester, his good hand steadying her arm, his voice a low rumble in her ear. She was a natural student, her hands steady, her eye clear. She was not learning to be a killer. She was learning to be a survivor. The attack came on a cool morning in early April. A lone rider was spotted on the horizon, then another, and another, until a gang of a dozen men crested the ridge, their forms dark against the pale morning sky. They rode with a swaggering confidence, certain that their numbers would overwhelm the solitary, wounded rancher they had come to destroy. "They're here," Gus called from his lookout post on the ridge. There was no panic, Emily's quiet preparations had seen to that. She stood on the porch of the small house, the Winchester held firmly in her hands. Eli was beside her, his own rifle resting on the porch rail, his face set in grim lines. "Remember the plan?" Emily said, her voice clear and carrying in the still air. "Let them come close. We make every shot count." The riders advanced, fanning out as they approached the wash that led to the ranch house. It was the trap Emily had laid. As the first men entered the narrow, high-walled gully, a shot rang out from the rocks above. One of the riders cried out and clutched his arm, his horse rearing in panic. The confident advance dissolved into chaos. More shots followed. From Gus on the ridge, from Mateo and Tom hidden in the rocks. The wash became a shooting gallery. The riders pinned down, their numbers now a disadvantage in the confined space. A few of the more determined men broke free. Galloping hard for the open ground in front of the house, this was the moment Emily had been waiting for. She raised her rifle, sighted down the long barrel, and fired. Her shot went wide, kicking up dust near a horse's hooves. But it served its purpose. It showed them that the house itself was defended. Eli fired next, his aim true. One of the riders toppled from his saddle. The others hesitated, their greed warring with their instinct for self-preservation. From her position on the porch, Emily saw it all. She saw not just targets, but men who had been bought, men who had been lied to. The shootout raged for nearly an hour, a chaotic symphony of rifle cracks, ricocheting bullets, and the terrified whinnying of horses. Eli and Emily held the porch, their fire coordinated, forcing the attackers to keep their distance, one by one. The judge's men lost their nerve. A couple of them turned and fled, their desire for gold extinguished by the very real prospect of dying for it. Then, something unexpected happened. A young man, no older than 20, his face smudged with dirt and fear, threw his rifle into the dust. He raised his hands high above his head. "Don't shoot!" he yelled, his voice cracking. "I'm done!" He walked forward slowly, his hands in the air. Eli kept his rifle trained on him, his expression wary. "What do you want?" Eli called out. The young man stopped a dozen yards from the porch. He looked not at Eli, but at Emily, who stood beside him, her rifle still held at the ready, her face determined. He had expected a she-devil, a murderess. He saw a woman defending her home. "We were told lies about you," he said, his voice filled with a dawning shame. "Boone, the man who hired us, he said you were a witch, said you'd killed your husband in his sleep and that this man," he nodded toward Eli, "was your partner in crime. He said this land was forfeit. He didn't say anything about you fighting back like this." He looked around at his remaining comrades, who were now wavering, their confidence shattered. "This ain't worth dying for." His surrender broke the back of the attack. The remaining men, seeing their numbers dwindling and their resolve gone, mounted their horses and galloped away, leaving their wounded companions behind. Just as the last of the riders disappeared over the ridge, a cloud of dust appeared on the horizon. A large group of riders was approaching, moving fast. For a heart-stopping moment, Emily thought the judge had sent reinforcements, but as they drew closer, she recognized the figure at the head of the group. It was Sheriff Miller, and behind him rode nearly every able-bodied man from Redemption. Silas Blackwood had ridden for help after all. The townsfolk arrived not to a battle, but to its aftermath. They saw the wounded men being tended to by Tom and Gus. They saw the young man who had surrendered, his head bowed in shame. And they saw Emily and Eli standing side by side on their porch, bruised, exhausted, but unbroken. Emily, the woman they had whispered about and condemned, stood with a rifle in her hand, not as a killer, but as a defender. Eli, the man they had pitied and ostracized, stood beside her, his wounded arm a testament to his courage. The sight was a powerful one. It was a truth more potent than any rumor. The whispers died in their throats. replaced by a grudging, dawning respect. Sheriff Miller, his face a mixture of awe and embarrassment, dismounted and walked toward the porch. "McCrae, Mrs. Croft, we heard there was trouble." "The trouble is over, Sheriff," Eli said, his voice flat. "No thanks to you." The shift in opinion was not sudden, but it was undeniable. The story of the battle at McCrae's ranch spread through the territory, embellished with every telling. The tale of the preacher's daughter who had stood her ground against a dozen hired guns became a local legend. A week later, Judge Silas Vance was found dead in his suite at the town's only hotel. The official report from the territorial marshal listed the cause of death as a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Some said he had taken his own life out of shame, his power and reputation shattered. Others whispered that his dark heart had simply given out. No one mourned him. With his death, his vast, corrupt estate collapsed like a house of cards. The bounty on Eli's land vanished. The legal claims were dismissed. The shadow that had loomed over them for so long was finally, truly gone. Emily was free. The law had no claim on her, but freedom did not erase the scars. The whispers in town did not disappear entirely. They simply softened, changed from condemnation to a wary, fascinated curiosity. Some of the townswomen would still cross the street to avoid her. She was a curiosity, a woman with a past, a woman who had fought like a man. One day, on a trip to the general store, she felt the weight of their stares, the sudden silence as she entered. The old Emily would have lowered her gaze and fled, but she was not the old Emily anymore. She turned from the counter, her small bag of flour in her hand, and faced the silent, watching townspeople. "My name is Emily McCrae," she said, her voice not loud, but carrying a quiet, unshakable authority. "I have been judged in a courtroom and judged by all of you. I am done with being judged." She looked from one face to another, her gaze unflinching. "You do not have to like me. You do not have to approve of me. You only have to let me live." She turned and walked out, her head held high. The silence she left behind was different. It was the silence of consideration, of a truth that could no longer be denied. Life on the ranch settled into a new rhythm, one of peace and purpose. The old, ransacked house held too many ghosts. Eli, with the help of Silas, Tom, and Mateo, began to build a new one. He chose a spot on a gentle rise, overlooking the canyon, with a view of the sunrise. It was bigger than the old house, with wide windows to let in the light. It was a house built not for solitary survival, but for a shared future. While the men worked on the heavy timbering, Emily found her own way to build their new life. She painted the interior walls herself, not a stark white, but a warm, creamy color that seemed to hold the light. She planted a small garden, her hands finding a deep, quiet satisfaction in the feel of the cool, dark earth. One evening, as the house was nearing completion, she found Eli on the new porch, a small carving knife in his hand. He was carefully, lovingly, carving her name into the smooth wood of the porch rail, Emily. He looked up as she approached, a small, genuine smile on his face. He had built her a home, and now he was writing her name into its very heart. Their wedding day arrived with the full bloom of spring. The prairie, which had been a place of harshness and desolation, was now carpeted in a riot of wildflowers. There were no invitations, no guests, no preacher. Their vows had already been made, not in words, but in blood and loyalty and the quiet building of a life together. As the sun began to set, casting a warm, golden glow over the land, Emily emerged from the new house. She was wearing her old white wedding dress. She had washed and mended it with painstaking care. It was no longer a shroud of shame and fear. It was a symbol of her survival, a testament to the woman she had become. Eli stood waiting for her under the shade of a lone, ancient cottonwood tree whose branches were dotted with new, green leaves. He wore a clean shirt. His hair was neatly combed, and his blue eyes were filled with a love so deep and steady it took her breath away. As she walked toward him, a gentle breeze lifted the veil she had chosen not to wear. It whispered through the cottonwood leaves, a sound like a benediction. She reached him and stopped, her heart full. Slowly, she lifted her hands to her shoulders and unclasped the cream-colored shawl. She let it drop. It fell to the wildflower-strewn ground without a sound, a final, quiet act of release. She looked up at him, and this time, she was smiling, a real, radiant, unafraid smile. And this time, he did not hesitate. He reached out, took her hand in his, and led her inside. Thank you for joining us around the campfire for this story. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from to connect with fellow travelers. Please subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.